I'm very, very excited for this next conversation. Representative Mikie Sherrill of New Jersey is a graduate of the Naval Academy and spent nearly a decade in the U.S. Navy flying missions as a helicopter pilot. She's tough. She was elected to Congress in 2019 and is a member of the House Armed Services Committee. It's been a while. I'm going to divulge that I think the last time I saw you was Michael's Restaurant in New York, so it's great to see you again. Thank you for joining us. We've been talking about the global map, national security, foreign policy. You know, you're a new member of Congress, and you've brought a lot of heft very quickly to the National Defense Authorization Act, on which you've offered many amendments. What do you look at as the highest priorities on that committee right now of the gaps and holes we need to fill in our national security position?
That's a great question. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, that seems like a long time at Michael's, actually, that we would be out in a restaurant, not socially distancing, in New York City. But it's great to be on today. And I'll tell you something that kind of dovetails with your question, I think is the purview of your talk today. I was reading about this event and the idea of what jobs in national security do we have to invent or reinvent. And I think that's the greatest issue that we have in the National Defense Authorization Act is how do we modernize our forces? How do we make sure that we're preparing for future threats? And it's really difficult because what we're trying to do in some instances is move money into new programs for hardware that hasn't been developed yet, for cutting edge hardware. So how do you make sure you're keeping soldiers and sailors safe and providing them with the equipment that they need, while what you want to be spending on as well is your modernization project? And you know, how do you find that balance? And I think that's critical now and has been critical in this defense budget, but I think it's going to get even more critical as we go forward with, I think, the economy under duress as it has been and will be for the next at least couple of years.
Well, we had Chairman Adam Smith on a little while ago, and he made a very big point. He said, look, we can't say yes to everything. There's limited resources. We need to have serious deliberative discussions about what national security challenges we're facing. Basically you could hear him saying, we need to be careful of overinvesting in the old stuff and get in the new stuff, which is similar. How do you say no? How do you say no, or how do you stop? Give our audience an idea, if you can, of what that's like, because I guess we live in a world where we don't see Congress stop many things that it's funded.
Right, and it's so difficult because you have, you have the defense manufacturing base, you have Congress members that want to have those jobs in their district. It's very hard to pull those jobs back to invest in new programs and new hardware, and I think that's why you have to look very carefully at how you're investing in modernization, how you're making sure that as you spend billions of dollars, that you're doing so across the country, that you're supporting the defense manufacturing base and the industrial base across the country. But I will tell you, I've been pretty lucky because my district has Picatinny Arsenal, which is one of the cutting edge research and development bases for the military. So I feel very well aligned with what we have to do in the military and what the base here is doing.
How has COVID-19 impacted those of you on the committee? I imagine people woke up and said, wow, look at how American society has been paralyzed. 44 million people unemployed, 150,000 people now dead. I mean, it's a killer, and it's a national security threat that just all of a sudden appeared on our shore. Has it changed the mood, the tempo, the way you think about security?
It certainly has. I'll tell you, I've been working in national security for decades now. The idea that we would have problems with our supply chains and our supply lines in a crisis like this wasn't my top focus for many years. I was a Russian policy officer. I've been focused on Russia. I've been focused on our foreign policy, the wars that we've been involved in, the future threats that we might see, and supply chain issues rarely, if ever, came up. I will say that, we were working on our logistics, building up our capacity in Iraq as we first went to war there, but that's slightly different from what we're looking at now. And it's become critical, and it's something that I think now we've moved a critical national security focus on. So just to give you an example of how we try to take care of people and what it means to keep people here secure. New Jersey had the worst outbreak at the beginning of this crisis, and we had more people on ventilators than we had anticipated or that we'd seen, and we needed the sedatives that go along with ventilators. And those sedatives were produced in Italy, and Italy was having an outbreak at the same time. And so they closed down their borders. They weren't releasing any of those sedatives. So we couldn't get them into the United States. So when you look at those critical supply chain linkages, I think going forward, what we're going to look at in national security is what has to be produced here and how much of it, and how much can we stockpile, and what do national stockpiles need to look like. I was shaken on March 12th. And just to give you a sense of what was going on in my district at that time period, March 13th, my kids didn't have school that day, and they did not go back to school for the rest of the year. So this was the day before the schools closed in Montclair. This was March 12th. I was sitting in a briefing in Congress to the House of Representatives and hearing the details of the national stockpile. And I remember thinking, well, that would take care of Denville, one town in my district. There's no way this is going to get us through a pandemic. And what was shocking was that there did not seem to be a sense of urgency from the briefers on the problems with the national stockpile. In fact, they said no one had asked for anything. And I went back home and the governor said, yeah, we've asked for quite a bit actually from the national stockpile. So that was odd. And then very shortly after that, I wrote to the president and asked, please implement the Defense Production Act. Make sure that we're using our manufacturing base to produce what we need here in this country. And he refused. So I think what we need to do is take a look at broadly how this country handles a national crisis like this, how this country is going to invest in the things we need and where those responsibilities are.
I want to ask a slightly unfair question, and I'll pile on to one that's come in from one of our audience members, Dr. Gus Frias, who's asked about, what if a big EMP attack hit the U.S. homeland? But let me pile on to that. Say, what if malware were released and sort of a Stuxnet type thing hit our electric power grid? What if a dirty bomb went off in the United States? What if we had, as Derek Chalet just said, a second pandemic, a pandemic on top of another one to come in? I mean, you just begin to sort of imagine right now that part of the problem is dealing with the complex nature of America in responding to this. And, everyone I've talked to, CEOs, governors, mayors, over the last several months, and we've been doing a daily interview, has said we need ever-present testing. We need testing everywhere, and we need testing to deliver results in minutes. And normally, you would think that's not a hard thing for a country like the United States to do. And then it asks, if you can't do that, can you handle these other potential crises that are out there? So let me just ask you, because you're briefed about classified stuff, I assume, how many big scenarios out there are going to completely crush America that we don't even know about because we can't perform even in something like this with fairly obvious things like testing? How many other complex responses can't we respond to, do you fear?
So I would argue we're handling several complex situations right now. Not all of them we're not handling them all very well, but we're handling the outbreak of a global pandemic. We're handling a national conversation about race and policing with protests across the country at the same time. So it is conceivable that another crisis will hit our country. And I guess the one thing I would sort of push against is the idea that our style of government is somehow too complex to handle this. I don't accept that. In fact, I think a democracy, actually, this is where we should have shown. This should have been our moment. The American moment in this century right now is handling this. We were really best equipped to handle this. We are the most transparent nation. We share data. We're open about the data. I think that's critical if you're going to handle a pandemic like this, to have transparent data so you know how to best attack the problem. We have a wonderful manufacturing base in this country. We could have manufactured everything we need, much of it right here. I'm from New Jersey. We have some of the best pharmaceutical companies in the world headquartered in my district. Even despite all the things I don't think we're doing as well as we could be doing, we are, I think, moving forward very quickly on a vaccination, and I hope to see that by the end of the year. So our country can and really should be handling this crisis better than any country on earth. And to be at a point where we're handling it worse than any country on earth. I don't think that is because of some complexity of our government. I think that's a lack of leadership.
I appreciate that perspective. And since you talked about transparency, are you worried at all about these apparent White House instructions that data from hospitals on COVID deaths and infections should go to the White House rather than to the CDC?
Certainly. I think it just sounds like, when you hear the president say he doesn't want testing, when you're hearing the attacks on Dr. Fauci, when you see that they're trying to move the reporting to the White House, all of this, I think, stymies our efforts on the ground to better understand the disease, better understand the transmission of the disease. Here in New Jersey, like I said, we had such a bad outbreak. I was on the phone with our hospital systems every single day during the height of the pandemic. And we started to very quickly identify outbreaks. So I would be on the phone and they say, we had St. Clair's has had a bunch of people coming in from Dover. So we have sent out a bunch of public health workers. We're talking to Dover. We're making sure that they understand the need for social distancing, masks, and trying to track down why we're having this outbreak. If somehow these reports were not transparent, if these weren't being published, if we weren't able to talk about it, we would not have realized where outbreaks were coming from. We wouldn't have been able to address them so quickly. So in any way to hinder reporting and testing and contact tracing, that just leads to more cases of coronavirus, which, like I said, the caseload right now is staggering in this country.
Representative, you served in the military, I think, for 10 years in the Navy. And so you have that perspective of having served and been in and been out there. And I'm just sort of interested in what that insight gives you into these times when you see orders that came from the White House to potentially police domestically protests around the country, or you look at the stresses. We just saw another tragic suicide of someone who had been deployed multiple times in Afghanistan, many tours, I think 6. I'm just worried about morale. I'm worried about, do we have a good insight into our American servicemen and women have served? You've been there. What do we need to know that we don't?
I'm concerned about morale, and I guess I'm concerned about morale because I am so personally upset that we've heard continuous reports of Russian bounties being placed on servicemen and women. And while there are, I think any of us who served and been involved with intelligence, you realize that there are many ways that you gather intelligence. There are many things that are said about the intelligence, contradictory things sometimes. But what so concerns me is we've not heard anything from the president. And when I was at the White House to receive a briefing, we specifically asked, the president, as commander-in-chief of this country, needs to assure the men and women that are fighting for our country that he will do everything he can to get to the bottom of these reports, and if they're true, that he will hold Russia accountable. And I think what is so upsetting is not that he might, not that he hasn't gotten to the bottom of it yet. I mean, we're calling in intelligence agencies to get to the bottom of this. He should be at the forefront of that. But that while this is going on, while we know Russia's been a bad actor in Afghanistan, we know Russia's been a bad actor and against our international interests in Syria, they have constantly been thwarting attempts that we have to promote democracy across the world over the last several decades and longer. And yet here the president is, he's had 5 calls with Vladimir Putin since March. He's advocating for Russia to be part of the G7. And this does not make sense to me. The longer we don't hold Russia accountable, the more Russia pushes the boundaries. And I think that the servicemen and women who are serving overseas know that. And I think that they're troubled by the fact that there's a sense that the commander-in-chief of the United States doesn't have the backs of our servicemen and women. And that's what I'm asking to hear from the White House.
Let me also ask you a little bit about the talent that we bring into our military services across the board in the Pentagon, but serving. I mean, you're an example of inclusion of women in the military service. But when you look at the higher ranks, the higher levels, the generals, the admirals, both those of color and, in terms of gender fairness, it's still very, very thin. In fact, there was a major New York Times expose on how few black generals, admirals, and sort of command staff there were. Is there any serious effort right now to change that, to take, to basically broaden this beyond white males?
Certainly. That is something that we've pushed for in the National Defense Authorization Act. The House version right now that came out of committee has a chief diversity officer to look at exactly what you're talking about. I know we heard from the Secretary of Defense about some of the measures he's taking to ensure we have greater diversity. It's really, I think the thing that's so disheartening about this, I just celebrated might be a funny word because Clete Summer was tough, but I just had the 30th anniversary of the day I entered into the Naval Academy on July 3rd. And my classmates were writing, and I was thinking about that. And that was 30 years ago. And we were having the same conversations 30 years ago.
Wow. And
we have spent millions of dollars to solve these problems. And yet we still have not seen the results that we want to see. So I think I will tell you what is heartening is that when we talked about having a special prosecutor to address the sexual assaults that are taking place at our service academies, and that, there were some people that spoke against that and tried to put that into a study. And yet I spoke up and talked about my experiences as a Naval Academy midshipman, my classmates' experiences that I knew firsthand. This wasn't something that I'd read about or that I'd heard. This was lived experience. Elaine Luria, another Naval Academy graduate, we're the first two female Naval Academy graduates to serve. She again spoke strongly because she was a commander and knew how the chain of command works and could speak strongly about the need to support women. When we see Vanessa Guillen and the murder that took place, I think we are up for a reckoning in this area in a way that I haven't felt in recent times. And I think the same thing can be said for the lack of diversity, racial diversity that we see at the top echelons of our military. And I will also say that something that we focused on in the National Defense Authorization Act is the idea of Confederate bases that have Confederate names on the streets or the houses or the bases themselves, the Confederate battle flag. I know the Navy and Marine Corps have already banned it from their bases. I'm looking for the Army and Air Force to follow suit. And I'm in a group of Academy graduates, and this is a discussion. And many of the Academy graduates will tell you this does not represent the reasons we served, and it doesn't represent our values. So I think these are important conversations that we're having, and much of this you'll see in the House's version of the National Defense Authorization Act.
Well, Representative Mikie Sherrill, I am grateful for your time and insights. I look forward to the time that we can actually, on the other side of this pandemic, meet in a restaurant in New York again, or New Jersey, Montclair, wherever. But great to see you, and thanks so much for your very, very valuable and thoughtful insights today.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.